I'm Amy Goodman. Today, in a Black History Month special, we spend the hour with the legendary pianist and composer Randy Weston. For the past 6 decades, Weston has been a pioneering jazz musician, incorporating the vast rhythmic heritage of Africa. The poet Langston Hughes once wrote, quote, "When Randy Weston plays, a combination of strength and gentleness, virility and velvet emerges from the keys in an ebb and flow of sound seemingly as natural as the waves of the sea." Randy Weston's most famous compositions include Little Niles, Blues Moses, and this tune, High Fly. Randy Weston's 1960 recording, Uhuru Afrika, was a landmark recording that celebrated the independence movements in Africa and the influence of traditional African music on jazz. The record, which began with a freedom poem written by Langston Hughes, would later be banned by the South African apartheid regime, along with albums by Max Roach and Lena Horne. In 1961, Randy Weston visited Africa for the first time as part of a delegation that also featured Nina Simone. The trip would transform Weston's life and lead him to eventually move to Africa in 1967. In 2001, he was named a jazz master by the National Endowment for the Arts. It's considered to be the nation's highest honor in jazz. Now 85 years old, Randy Weston continues to tour the world. In 2002, he performed at the inauguration of the new library of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina in Egypt. In 2010, Weston played at the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Senegal's founding as an independent republic. Also, in 2010, Duke University Press published African Rhythms, the Autobiography of Randy Weston. The book's cover says it was composed by Randy Weston and arranged by Willard Jenkins. On Saturday, Randy Weston will lead his African Rhythms Orchestra at a concert at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center here in New York at the Borough of Manhattan Community College to celebrate James Reese Europe and the Harlem Hellfighters. Last week, I sat down with Randy Weston at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center, and I began by asking him to talk about his parents.
My dad was born in Panama. He lived 7 years in Cuba, and he came to Brooklyn, settled in Brooklyn. My mother came from Virginia, a small town called Meredithville, and she came to New York, and they got together and produced Randy Weston. And I grew up in a very powerful spiritual, cultural area in Brooklyn, what they call Bedford-Stuyvesant. See, we had to be in the black church every Sunday. That was required. Everybody had to take art. You had to take piano or trumpet or violin or dance. That was in the neighborhood. And economically, everybody didn't have money. But culture was so wonderful. We had the blues bands on the corner. We had the calypso. We had the big band rehearsals during the day. And my dad gave me 2 things. He was very influential. He said, number one, my son, you are an African born in America. Therefore, you have to study the history of Africa when Africa had its great civilizations, before colonialism, before slavery. So because of my dad,
you are an African born in America.
Yes, yeah, he's very clear about that, you see. To know your history, because you're only going to get the history after colonialism and after slavery. So I'd go to the museums, and I used to read about the great empires of Egypt, of Songhai, of Ghana. And my dad had maps on the wall of African kings and queens and books. In addition, he made sure I took piano lessons, because I was 6 foot at 12 years old.
6 foot tall at 12 years old.
In those days, you know, I was a giant, right? I wanted to play basketball and football. My father made me take piano lessons. So my dad gave me Africa. He gave me music. My mom gave me the black church. But the 2 of them, they kept me very spiritual. And I always saw the similarities between African-American culture coming out of Virginia, my mother, my African Caribbean father coming out of Panama and Jamaica. So that's how I grew up, and the whole neighborhood was full of wonderful, wonderful people, great leaders, great artists, a lot of inspiration.
Marcus Garvey, what role did he play, and especially for young people today, who he was?
He was a super giant. You see, during that time, talking about 30s, 40s, 50s, we produced some really giants, and he was certainly one. His philosophy of Africa is our ancestral home. We were taken away, and those of us who are taken away, we have to give back. We have to rebuild our motherland, which is Africa. And all humanity comes out of Africa anyhow. So he was way ahead of his time. And he had the biggest organization of African people up until today. There was no computers, no airplanes. He traveled all through the States. He went to Europe, he went to the Caribbean. So he was a great philosopher.
The United Negro Improvement Association.
Exactly, and he gave that pride to our people because our history was taken away. And you know, your history of your ancestors is your foundation. So he gave us that. So he was a very, very important man. And my father loved Marcus Garvey. So he would have books of Marcus Garvey in the house, J. Rogers, all these great people, Hansberry, yes.
So you started with classical music, but
yes.
didn't like it too much.
No, because it didn't swing, you know. But I had a great piano teacher, God bless her. She was a sweetheart. 50 cents a lesson. Hit my hand with the ruler when I made a mistake, and I was always making mistakes because I had long legs, big feet. I didn't want to practice, you know. But she gave me that foundation. Then after 3 years, she told my father, forget it, your son will never play the piano. And I don't blame her. In fact, and I got her picture in the book because she gave me that foundation of the women of that time, how they had that dignity and pride and class, you know, and give you those music lessons. You want to make sure that you knew to play those lessons.
But your father wouldn't give up.
No way. He got another teacher, a guy named Professor Atwell, and he knew a few popular songs. So he taught me the classical tradition of piano, but also a few popular songs. And that's how I got to start to learn to play the piano.
So you're playing music, and then World War II.
Yeah, yeah. Well, World War II, I was drafted in the Army, spent 3 years in the Army. They had little local bands, but even before World War II, we had small local bands in Brooklyn, you know. And we play everything from polkas to marriages, you name it, you know. Little small groups, people like the great Ray Copeland, people like Cecil Payne, all these musicians, and we had the great Max Roach in Brooklyn. And a lot of giants lived in Brooklyn. U.B. Blake lived in Brooklyn. So the world, and we had Black Musicians Club at that time, you see. So we can go to this club as kids and see the older musicians. They'd be playing cards, or they have a blackboard. They say, son, you're going to play over there? Make sure you get $2, not $1. So we had that respect and love for the ancestors.
So who are you watching then? Who are you listening to?
Oh, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Coleman Hawkins, you know, Louis Armstrong, Art Tatum.
Did you meet Louis Armstrong?
Yes, I shook his hand. That was enough. I shook his hand in Oklahoma City when I made my first tour with the rhythm and blues band, Boom Moose Jackson. And he was in the hotel room. He said, you want to meet Louis Armstrong? Of course I want to meet the king, you know. So he was in the room, and I shook his hand, and that was it. But the handshake I'll never forget.
Count Basie.
Count Basie. Count Basie, I used to play opposite Count Basie at Birdland when I started playing trio. I loved Basie because of his touch, his class, and his love of the blues, because Basie played all kind of blues. And I finally met him at a festival in Holland, of all places. And I used to try to play like Count Basie. So when I saw him, I said, Count, I just want you to know how much I love you and how much you gave me on the piano. He said, oh, man, don't talk like that. But Basie was very, very important.
And what about Felonious Monk, Randy?
Felonious Monk, the magic man. Felonious Monk became in my life because of my love for Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins was my idol. Coleman Hawkins go back to the Fletcher Henderson days in the early 20s, you know, all the way up to the first one to record Dizzy, the first one to record Monk, the first one to record Miles Davis was Coleman Hawkins. So I used to go to 52nd Street all the time in those days. You can go in these great clubs, one next to each other, all the masters of the music, Louis Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins, you name it, you know. And I went one night to hear Coleman Hawkins. And he had this guy playing the piano. And what he was playing, I didn't understand what he was playing. I said, you know, I don't know what he's doing with this guy. You know, I can play more piano than this guy, you know. But I went back. Then I discovered the genius of Monk, fell in love with his music, and spent almost 3 years just hanging out with Monk, picking him up, taking him to Brooklyn, taken to my father's house. My dad had a restaurant at that time.
Trios?
Yeah, trios. We were open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We had the hippest jukebox in the world. On the jukebox had everybody from Louis Jordan to Duke Ellington to Nat King Cole to Sarah Vaughan on the other side, Prokofiev, Shostakovich, Darius Milhaud. So musicians would come all night long and argue, who's better, Coleman Hawkins or Lester Young? So culturally, it was an incredible period because I spent time, I listened to our royalty of this music.
The legendary jazz musician Randy Weston as we continue this Black History Month special. Randy Weston playing High Fly, his song about being 6'8". This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to my conversation as we sat at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center in Lower Manhattan with the legendary jazz pianist and composer Randy Weston. After serving in a segregated Army unit during World War II, he returned to his home in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. He later moved to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts, a decision that changed his life.
After we came out of the Army, the powers that be put the heroin into the black community. And they always picked the artists for drugs, always, because the artists influenced the people, you know, and it was spread throughout the neighborhood. And I wanted to get away. And luckily I had a good friend of mine. He was a semi-professional basketball player. His name was Lefty Morris, and he played with a team up in Lenox, Mass. He said, Randy, he said, you go up to the Berkshires, take any kind of job. He said, because it's full of music. The Boston Symphony's there during the summer, chamber music. People love music. So that's what I did. I went up there.
And you were able to kick the habit totally there?
I'm sorry?
You were able to kick the habit totally?
Yeah, yeah, because I needed a change of atmosphere, you see. So I was very blessed. I met great people. I met everybody from Lucas Foss to Leonard Bernstein. I played with some of the members of the symphony orchestra, because by that time they encouraged me. When I wasn't working in the kitchen, and I became a breakfast cook after a while.
This is at the Music Inn?
Yeah, at the Music Inn, and they heard me play piano, and that's when I decided.
So you were there hired as a dishwasher?
As a breakfast cook, actually. I was a dishwasher at the resort before the Music Inn, which was called Seven Hills.
And the folks that ran either Seven Hills or Music Inn heard you when they were just coming down late at night?
Exactly, in both places actually. But Music Inn was important because Professor Marshall Stearns, he was starting his series of lectures about the history of African American music. So because of Marshall, he brought people like Mahalia Jackson, like Dan Burley, like Duke Ellington, like Butterfly McQueen, Billy Taylor, Candido, Olatunji. He had a global concept of African culture. I met John Lee Hooker because of Marshall Stearns, Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry. So I saw the whole connection. Dr. Willis James from Spelman College, he specialized in field cry hollers. So I understood more about the impact of African civilization on world civilization. Can
you play a little? What inspired you at that time? What you were playing at that time?
I was thinking about James Reese Europe and this great, great man who's been forgotten about in our history, you know.
James Reese Europe.
Yeah, a phenomenal individual.
Born in the 19th century.
Exactly, Mobile, Alabama. He was a pianist, composer from Washington to New York, organized what they called the Clef Club. At that time, everything was segregated. He formed the first black union. He had a hotel in the 50s. It was called the Clef Club. Entertainers could come there. He had 7 orchestras, and he could play any kind of music in these orchestras. All tuned musicians. Carnegie Hall, 1912, with 125 musicians with 10 pianos. And he said, this is before the word jazz. The word jazz didn't happen until 1915. Before that, it was just black music, or African-American music, or African music. Then, in addition to that, joined the U.S. Army, became a lieutenant, got 60 musicians, went to Puerto Rico, got some more musicians, went to France. They were the first ones to play this music. And French had never heard this music before. You see, because during the war, the French soldiers and American soldiers were gassed by the Germans. So they have these cultural, spiritual, therapeutic places in France, you know, where you get the thermal water and whatnot. So James Reese Europe played 25 cities in France during the First World War.
When he played in Carnegie Hall, was it an integrated orchestra?
No, he was strictly black culture. He said, we have a culture, African people.
Can you play a little that inspires you?
I'm going to play a piece, I just thought about it. It's called In Memory Of.
I want to get to you moving to Africa, but before that, Langston Hughes. Talk about meeting him and how he inspired you and what you did together.
So many ways. Again, Marshall Stearns.
Marshall Stearns, the white professor, Western Mass.
Exactly. He brought Langston Hughes up to the Berkshires, to the Music Inn. And I met Langston automatic connection between two, and I was very young. I wasn't a professional pianist now. I'm playing at night and I'm cooking during the day, but I wasn't a professional musician. But to make a long story short, he knew my interest in Africa, knew my interest in African culture. So as it turned out, in 1961, the very first summit of African Americans going to Africa was in Nigeria, and Langston was part of that movement. And then later on, with the great Melba Liston, when we did the Freedom Africa suite, I asked Langston, would he kindly write a freedom poem for me? Because the African country was just getting their independence in 1960. 17 African countries got their independence in 1960. So I wanted to create a work of music celebrating this freedom of Africa. So Langston wrote a freedom poem for me, and also he wrote the words, a song I call African Lady. That song was dedicated to our mothers, our sisters, those African women who were always in the background, who always supported us, you see. And then finally we
Can you play a little?
Oh yeah, you mean which one? African Lady? Sure.
You mentioned the freedom poem of Langston Hughes. Do you remember it?
Well, it's like You know, what we did was this. As a boy, I was always upset with Tarzan movies, you know, because the image of African people in Hollywood was rather hard, that's putting it mildly, the image, you know. And I was always upset with what they call African languages, like African people have no language, you know. So the freedom poem, I wanted to put the freedom poem in an African language. So when people hear the music, they realize the beauty of African languages and that language began in Africa in the first place, okay? So I went to Langston, and Langston, the freedom poem was like Africa, Uhuru, which means freedom.
Africa, where the great Congo flows.
Where the great Congo flows, Africa, Uhuru. And Uhuru is Kiswahili. And so when I went to the United Nations, I talked to a number of diplomats at that time. I said, well, how could I use one African language? There's so many languages in Africa. How could I choose one? So the general consensus was use Kiswahili. So I had this guy, his name was Tutemeke Sanga from Tanzania, Tanganyika at that particular time. And he was a scholar of Swahili. So what he did, he took Langston's poem from English to Kiswahili. And his diction and his voice was so wonderful, we used him on a recording of Uhuru Afrika.
Africa, where the great Congo flows. Africa, where the whole jungle knows a new dawning breaks. Africa, a young nation awakes. Africa, Uhuru. Africa, Uhuru. Africa.
Randy Weston, talk about the making of Uhuru Afrika, one of the great albums that you're known for.
Melba Liston, truly one of the greatest arrangers in the history of our music, without question.
She had worked with Dizzy Gillespie.
Yes, she worked with Dizzy. I heard her with Dizzy playing trombone. I heard an arrangement of My Reverie. An arrangement
She played trombone.
Yeah.
Now, this is rare.
Great trombone. I know. She's the only woman I heard play a trombone. And she's with Dizzy's orchestra at Birdland. I was there this night, and she got this big sound. I said, I never heard a woman playing trombone before.
What year is this?
This has had to be early 50s. Early 50s, because we collaborated in 58 for the first time. So when she came off the bandstand, I said, I got to meet this lady, you know, and I shook her hand like electricity between us. So as it turned out, she moved to New York. She's originally from Kansas City, lived in Los Angeles, and she liked Mary Lou Williams. Mary Lou was living in Harlem, so they knew each other. These are two queens of music, these two, you know. So I got together with her, and we had the same feeling. You see, artistically, I guess Paul Robeson said it best. An artist is responsible to fight for freedom. An artist is responsible to change society. That's how Paul put it, very good. But not only you have to be good at your craft, but you have to make a contribution to society, you know. And what better contribution than we make to the African people? Because they put on the bottom of the human scale. You know, no education, we've contributed nothing, blah, 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 blah. So I want to do this suite, African suite, and it was in 4 movements. The first movement was called Uhuru Kwanzaa, which in Kiswahili means freedom first. The second movement was called African Lady. The third movement was called Bantu. And the fourth movement was meant Cheza Blues. When the world recognizes the contribution of Africa to civilization, especially in art and music, we're going to celebrate. We're going to play some music in Fiji and Brazil and Congo. We have a big world celebration. So Melba, thanks to her, she got some of the great musicians in the orchestra, incredible musicians. The trumpet section, Freddie Hubbard, Richard Williams, Benny Bailey, Clark Terry. Trombone section, Slide Hampton, Jimmy Cleveland, Quentin Jackson. Julius Watkins on French horn. Saxophone section, Yusef Lateef, Sahib Shahab, Cecil Payne, G.G. Grice, Jerome Richardson, okay? Kenny Burrell on guitar, Les Band on guitar, and also flute. Now the rhythm section was powerful. Ron Carter on bass, George DeVivier on bass, percussion, Candido, Armando Peraza.
Candido, the Cuban musician.
Yeah, him and Armando Peraza, the great bongo player from Cuba. Olatunji from Nigeria. You had Charlie Pacific coming out of up in Massachusetts, you know. But the whole idea, and we had two singers, Al Mims and Leon James, and Max Roach played marimba.
Can you play some more?
Yeah, sure. Which one do you want to hear?
You choose.
Okay. This is Cacheza Blues, the last movement of Uhuru.
1960, you finish Uhuru Afrika. We're talking about, this is after Rosa Parks sits down on the bus, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama. Also, Africa, what is happening throughout the countries in Africa, the independence movements.
Sure. You
want to get this produced, this album. Do you have trouble?
Yeah, because at that time, you know, the whole idea of separating our people. To say Africa has no history, so don't look back. But see, I had a great mother and father because that generation, they only told you a few words. And my father always said, they tell you don't look back. He said, always look back. So what he meant is that my ancient ancestors go back to the great civilization of Egypt and Songhai, Ghana. He said, we come from royalty. You see, I was so lucky. That was my dad, you see. So for me, it's always been that way of thinking. Who was Louis Armstrong's grandmother and his grandfather? Where did that music come from? So I had to go to Africa to understand that music was created in Africa. And music was created from the universe because our ancient ancestors, they knew that music came from the universe. It was the Creator's way of giving the people on earth some healing, some beauty, music, you see. So, you know, I got all that incredible history, but it came from mom and pop, remembering certain things that they told me.
Could you talk a little about African Cookbook and how you came to make that album?
Well, again, that was during my period of wanting to write music about Africa, and I found out...
Before you moved there?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I found out that I heard African 6/8 rhythm, you know.
What does that mean?
I found out that rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that rhythm, you can dance if you're 2 years old or if you're 90, okay? So that rhythm, I want to have that rhythm, which would represent the southern part of Africa. I want to do that. I want the melody to represent the northern part of Africa. So the melody would represent the north, you see. So that's how it was, and I had a great group, a great Mr. Big Black, one of our greatest percussionists. Came originally from South Carolina, close to the Geechee people outside of South Carolina, very close to Africa. And Bill Wood was on bass, and that's how I created the African Cookbook. And was probably named for Booker Irvin, too, because he was such a great saxophonist. And sometimes we would play so good, we would say, Cookbook, cook, you know. So it's a combination of those things where I had the title.
Legendary jazz musician Randy Weston here on Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue with the great jazz master Randy Weston, as we sat together on the stage of the Tribeca Performing Arts Center, where he's performing on Saturday night.
So you go to Africa, 1961?
Yes.
Where'd you go?
Nigeria. Yeah. There were 29 of us. The first pilgrimage to go home to the motherland. And some of the people were Jeffrey Holder, Brock Peters, myself, 8 members of Lyle Hampton's band, Natalie Hinderis, great concert pianist.
You're on a State Department tour.
No, this wasn't the State Department.
No.
No. This was an organization called the American Society of African Culture. And they used to bring African artists to New York. Ethiopian painters, singers from Nigeria. So they already had that organization, and they had a base in Lagos. So I had Al Mims and Leon James, 2 of the great jazz dancers from the Savoy Ballroom. Dr. Willis James was there. Dr. Horace Bond was there. So there were 29. Nina Simone was there. Ahmed Abdul Malik.
Nina Simone was there.
Yeah.
You knew Nina Simone well.
Together. Yeah. And we spent 10 wonderful days to see what was the relationship of African-American culture and African-Nigerian culture. So we'd have 2 jazz dancers on this side of the stage, have some traditional dancers on this side of the stage, because we want to know where these rhythms come from. And they all come from Africa. All come from Africa, you know. And so I would hang out at night in the clubs, and that's where I met the great Bobby Benson. Bobby Benson owned a club called the Cabin Bamboo in Lagos. He played incredible guitar, and he also was a drummer. And because of him, I'd be there every night, and I heard all the young West African musicians. And I played with Fela in 1963 when he played trumpet.
Fela Kuti.
Yeah.
Nigeria.
Yeah, Nigeria, 63, before he played saxophone. See. And so I came in contact, but what was more important, on the weekend, he would bring the traditional people from Nigeria. It was my first live contact with African traditional music. And when you hear the traditional music of Africa, you go to school. Because they do things in music we cannot do. Why? Because their music captured the spirit of the continent itself. And the continent itself was swinging before man ever arrived, you know. You watch the way the crocodiles and the elephants, everything is in rhythm. Everything's in rhythm. The birds, everything's in rhythm. So early man listened to the nature of Mother Africa. And that's the foundation of world music, you see. So it was a wonderful trip, because it was my first introduction to Africa. And when we arrived about 11 o'clock at night, myself and Jeffrey Holder and Brock Peters, we were the tallest of the group. And they must have had about 50 African drummers. And we smelt that air of continent. And I said, wow, my ancestors were taken away from Africa in slavery. And how blessed we are, we're coming back to Africa in an airplane. And we hear all these drums, you know. So some of us kiss the ground, yeah, because we know that's our ancestral home, yeah.
Randy Weston, so you've taken us through your first journey in Africa. You come back home and you decide to fight discrimination against black musicians, African-American musicians.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about forming this organization.
Well, it was Ray Bryant, the great pianist. We had the Lewis Brown, the saxophonist, Nadi Kamar. He played piano and also kalimba, African music. We had John Handy and Sadiq Hakim. And we had a 3-day conference at Reverend Weston's church in Harlem, 3 days. And the whole idea, we were the first ones to get anti-discrimination clauses in union contracts. Because you have to remember, during the time of James Reed's Europe, there were separate unions, completely separate, you see. James was the first one to organize African-American musicians, and we had musicians clubs in Brooklyn, Harlem. The last one now is in Buffalo, New York, of all places. It's called the Last Musicians Colored Club. It's called in Buffalo. Yeah. So we had a 3-day conference, and we had women come and cook all the food. So we invited A. Philip Randolph.
A. Philip Randolph,
Yes.
the organizer of the Sleeping Car Porters.
Exactly.
The organizer of the, what, 1963 March on Washington?
Exactly.
Was this the same time?
The same time. This was 1960 or 61, one of the two. And he came, and he spoke to us about labor conditions, what we can do to better our rights as musicians. It was hard to get gigs. Racism was as usual, you know. And the second day, we had Professor John Henry Clark. And John Henry Clark told us our history as an African people. You have to know your history. You have to know Africa when Africa was great, because you're not going to get it in the school system. You're not going to get it in Hollywood. Okay? So we had a 3-day conference, and we formed the organization. But, you know, we were frustrated musicians. I'm not an organizer. But we kept together 1 year. We invited recording companies to try to help musicians, try to help these great musicians who are working in clubs with terrible conditions, no dressing rooms. You see people like Monk, like Dexter Gordon, these giants working in clubs. There's no place to even change their clothes, you see.
Very different from white musicians?
Yeah, you see. Well, sometimes white musicians have the same conditions, but they could go back home.
Right before you moved to Africa, your now close friend, Langston Hughes, dies.
Yes.
He requests, when he was still alive, that you would perform at his funeral.
Exactly.
What did you perform?
All blues. Langston's secretary called me on the phone. They said, Langston has passed away and he wants you to play his funeral. I said, what? With a trio. Okay. I knew Langston loved the blues with a passion. So we got to the funeral home, and Langston is laying in the coffin, you know, and we were on this side, about 200 people. Dr. Ralph Bunche was there. Lena Horne was there.
Dr. Ralph Bunche, the United Nations.
Yes, yeah, Lena Horne was there. You know, all the heavyweights. Arna Bontemps was there. So he said, you started. So what I did was I played 1 hour of blues for Langston. And he was such an incredible human being, Langston Hughes, that the secretary called me about 2 weeks later. He said, make sure the musicians get union scale. So he was putting us all, even when he passed away. But he was a great man because he knew the importance of African-American music. He knew that the spirituals and the blues was revolutionary music. He knew that without this music, we would never have survived anything, you see. But the music has always been put in the background. But if it wasn't for that music, we'd have gone nowhere. But with those songs of Billie Holiday and Duke and Basie and Louis Jordan, they lift our spirits as a people. So Langston was incredible.
Can you play a little of what you played that day?
Oh, well, I'll play the blues.
Randy Weston blues for Langston Hughes. 1967.
Yeah.
Langston Hughes dies in May.
Right.
And before the end of the year, you've moved to Africa. Talk about that decision and where you went.
Well, I'm sure it's because of Marshall Stearns. He was on the State Department board, that's for sure. Unfortunately, Marshall died before I had a chance to thank him. But I was chosen to do a State Department tour of 14 countries in 1967 of North Africa and West Africa and Beirut and Lebanon. And I put together a great band, Clifford Jordan on tenor saxophone, Ray Cropin on trumpet, Bill Wood on bass, and Ed Blackwell on drums, and Chief Bay on African drum. And I took my son with me as a dean. He was 15, Niles, at that particular time. And we had a wonderful, wonderful tour. And I requested whatever country we went to, I would like to be in touch with the traditional music of that country. And so we spent 3 months in Africa. And it was a good test for me because, you know, you can write music about Africa in New York, but the test is when you play that music on the continent itself. When I play music in Africa, I tell the people, this is your music. You may not recognize it because it came in contact with European languages, it came in contact with European instruments, you see, but it's your music, you know. And I always had Chief Bay, because Chief Bay always had the African traditional drum. So we had a big success in Africa because it was not only a concert, but having the people understand the impact of African rhythms in world music, whether it's Brazil or Cuba or Mississippi or Brooklyn, whatever. If you don't have that African pulse, nothing is happening.
So you moved Randy Weston to Morocco. Why Morocco?
Morocco was the very last country. And that's when I wanted to live in Africa because I wanted to be closer to the traditional people. And when you do a State Department tour, you have to make a report, what you like, what you didn't like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I stayed in Rabat for 1 week working on this report. And so I went back to New York. About 1 month later, we got these letters from Morocco saying the Moroccan people are crazy about your music, they want you to come back. So I had no idea I was going to be in Morocco because, number one, the language was spoken, Arabic, Berber, French, Spanish, very little English, see. But the power of music is the original language, is music, right? So I went back and ended up staying 7 years. And that's when I discovered the Africans who were taken in slavery who had to cross the Sahara Desert. I discovered these bands, I discovered their music, the Ganawa people in particular in Morocco. So that really enriched my life. You know.
Talk about the Ganawa people.
Yeah, the Ganawa people, they're originally from the great kingdoms of Songhai, Ghana, Mali, you know. And during the invasion from the north, they were taken as slaves and soldiers up to the north. But they created a very powerful spiritual music. And so I first met them in 1967, and we've been together up until this day. Because when you hear this music, you hear the origin of blues, of jazz, and black church all at the same time. You realize that, in other words, what has Mother Africa contributed to America? What has African people brought with them? Because when they were taken away, they had no instruments, no language, no nothing. How did they take these European instruments and create music? But when you hear the traditional people, you realize music began in Africa in the first place. And the music is so diverse because the continent itself is so diverse. So if you go to Sahara, you're going to have music of the Sahara. You go to the mountains, you have the music because African people create music based upon the way they live, their environment. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. So I was influenced by the Palladium, by the black church, by the blues, Mississippi. So where you know, it's the foundation of what you do.
Can you play Blue Moses a little bit?
Of course.
Randy Weston, you often quote the Somali poet Musa.
Yes. Yeah, he said, Musa, I met him in Nigeria in 1977. He said, Randy, I want to tell you one thing. He said, the first thing that changes the music, because music is the voice of God, is music. He said, music is our first language. We think French or English or Arabic or Spanish is our language. There was a time we didn't have those languages. The language was music because we listened to the music of the birds, we listened to the music of Mother Nature, we listened to the wind, the sound of thunder. So he says, when you have ordinary music, you're going to have ordinary times. Yeah, I'll never forget that. Yeah. And when you have creative music, you have creative times, because music, you can't see music, you can't touch music. Music is the king of the arts, you see. And so music is everywhere, but we tend to take music for granted. But imagine our planet without music. It'd be dead, because all people have their music, you see.
Back in Nigeria, music is also a means of political expression. You saw Fela Kuti perform 2 weeks before the Nigerian military raided the shrine.
Yes.
And his home, threw his mother out the window.
Right.
Can you talk about what that moment was like when you saw him perform and what he was performing?
He was the most courageous musician I ever met in my life. He wanted to be Africa to be free. He wanted Africa to have its own everything. Because, see, Africa is so rich. That's why everybody's there taking some. You know, way before slavery, they were taken from Africa because everything is there. Everything is there. So he symbolically, spiritually, the president of Africa. But what he meant was for African unity, you see. And sometimes the powers that be don't like that kind of freedom. And he was fearless, you know. Yeah, and I'll never forget the last time I saw him, you know, and I was so proud of Fela. I was so proud because he demonstrated, which Paul demonstrated, an artist, just playing your instrument is not enough. You have this talent for a reason. And you always got to serve the community. You got to serve humanity, one way or the other. Then you are a true artist, you see? And that's what Fela, that's what Paul, that's what all these people were like.
The great jazz master Randy Weston. He turns 86 in April. I interviewed him on the stage of the BMCC Tribeca Performing Arts Center in Manhattan, where he'll be performing on Saturday night. If you'd like to see the full interview, go to our website at democracynow.org, where you can also order